Hi there. We're going to take a look at chapter 2, which is about the managerial environment, and we're going to start off talking about the external environment. And what the external environment is, there are those things that are outside the organization that have some effect on the organization, but the management really doesn't have a lot of control over. So in this slide, you can see like politics and legal, um, social cultural changes, economic changes. These are things that go on beyond the organization that affect the organization. But again, like I mentioned, there's not a lot of control that the manager has over this. Now, part of being a manager, especially now, is that you have multiple generations in the workforce. For example, you may go to Walmart and you might see an older individual at the cash register or at the security area or working a deli. You may see that. And so these baby boomers are going back into the job market. And so they have their own special needs. And typically, baby boomers back in the day were loyalists. They stayed at jobs, they needed direction, but they were good, solid workers. Gen Xers, that's my generation, we wanted to rule the world. And we did a lot to mess up the world. Um, Ys and Zs, these two groups are more, especially the Zs, are more about family time, personal time than work. Where in X, it seemed to be that work was more important than family. That's changed now with the Z's thinking that family is more important than work. And I guess it really should be that way. All right, so how does the external environment affect the management? Obviously, jobs and employment. If we have a down economy, of course, we're not going to produce as much, and there won't be as many people working. Not as many people working, there won't be as many people buying. So it's like this vicious circle, if you will. Stakeholder relationships. We're going to talk about stakeholders very soon, which is the idea that any entity that touches an organization is considered a stakeholder. Now, in this next slide, you can see what these stakeholders are within organizations. So you see customers, you see employees. But the one thing that I want to point out with this is not every organization's stakeholders will have a different value depending upon the organization itself. Okay, so basically, organization A stakeholders for, let's say, unions might be different than how the unions would be in a stakeholder for organization B. It might be a non-union shop for that matter. Okay, so it's yes, all these will fit into an organization, or most will fit into an organization, but not all have equal value from one organization to another. Now, culture. These are one of the things that I absolutely stress to students is that culture matters. And actually matters so much, it's going to be your first keyword. And culture is something that holds organizations together. Now, culture can also tear organizations apart as well. And so we have to be careful here in how we approach culture. And typically culture comes from the leadership team or management team. And you can see in the slide here about the principles and traditions, absolutely. How we do our work, how we approach each other at work. That's all part of this culture. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Now, some dimensions of culture here. You can see like the stability, people. I've worked in organizations that had strong cultures. I've worked in organizations that had weak cultures. You definitely want the strong culture. And as you get further into this and talk about culture, when you're hiring, the person may have, you may have two people per se. You may have one person who's got absolutely strong skill sets, but doesn't fit into the culture, or one person that fits into the culture really well, but doesn't have the strong skill sets that the other person has. If it's me, I'm taking the person that fits into the culture. I've seen others that have strong skill sets and it doesn't fit the culture, it doesn't work. I have been in organizations where I didn't fit into the culture and it's hard. All right. And I wouldn't wish that on anyone. It's tough. You can do it and you can work through it, but it's very, very challenging. So where does the culture come from? The mission statement. The mission statement is our purpose of why we are who we are. And then the vision statement, we covered that in chapter 1 just briefly. It is a desired future state. Where do we want to be? Okay. Now, in regards to how employees learn a culture, first day they may get a tour of the plant or facility, and there might be a company history story. I've been part of that. There might be somewhere to sit down and have lunch with the management team. They also may have lunch with their coworkers. They may sit down and talk to HR, and they talk about what the culture is about. And one of the things I encourage you, whether you're going for your first career job, if you're changing jobs, if you're going for internships, ask that organization or person sitting across from you, describe your culture to me. If they can describe it to you right off the top of their head, terrific. If they had to sit and hem and haw about it and try to think of something, well, maybe not be such a strong culture. And if you have the opportunity to do peer interviews where you're trying for a position and some people that you would work with are interviewing you, ask them about the culture. That's one of the things, because if you don't fit into the culture, it's not going to go well, and you're going to have a really rough time with it. Okay, so what effect does a culture have on managers? Well, if you have a strong culture, it's a much easier job to manage because the people have strong work ethics. They know what needs to be done. They know how to do it. And so that's one of those things. Now, if you have a weak culture, whereas, maybe you got people goofing off, or maybe there's not a strong work ethic, or maybe they don't care about the work as much, that might be a little more challenging for the manager. And like I said in the first discussion in chapter 1, you don't want to be micromanagers. I don't want you to do that. But as you are doing this controlling that we talked about in chapter 1, you want to make sure that you're doing it within the guidelines of that culture, meaning that if it's expected that, hey, we have an extra quality check, or hey, we have to have 2 people sign off on a document, that's part of the work culture, and we have to make sure that that's done. Strong cultures. The reason, and I talked earlier how we're going to talk about cultures, and this is what I really wanted to talk about in terms of, if you have a strong culture, you already know what needs to be done. You know who's going to do what. You take this concept and you know the processes, you know the software being used, you know the ways that you talk to customers. Maybe you work in an organization where the management team will say, hey, my employees come first. I hope you do have something like that. Or you may have a management team that say, yep, you know what? My customers come first. I've worked in environments where the customers came first. I've worked in environments where the employees came first. And I'm telling you something, you want where the employees came first. I always said in a job I had years ago in printing that my job was to keep my sales rep very well dressed. And because she went talk to the customers were the number one priority of the organization, and the people on the floor who did the jobs, we appreciated somewhat, but nothing like organizations that put the employees first. And being put in employees first, this is where, for example, there was this gentleman named Harry Quadracci who was the founder of Quadrafix. And unfortunately, he's no longer with us. But one of the things he said that really struck me was that it wasn't the employees that kept him up at night, the thinking of the employees. It was thinking about the employees' families that kept him up at night. He was more worried about employees and their families than he was about the customers and the organization. And that is a great, great example of where and put people first. Okay, I'm getting a little off track with this, with the cultures. Okay, so as I talked about in that last slide, people know what to do. They know who to go to. They know what softwares to use, and that's the substitute for formal rules. If there shouldn't have to be rules in work. You should be able to come down and say, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're doing it. Now, with the caveat, if I may, please, with that formal rules, yeah, maybe there's you don't work overtime until you get pre-approval, or you only a certain person can do a certain things. Okay, that's something, but that's getting a stretch of a weak culture. But you really don't want the formal rules. Like for example, I had a place I worked, the the windows could only go up so much. And you may ask yourself, well, why is that? It was because the manager in that department, if she felt that the windows did not need to be up, like maybe it was too cold or whatever the case may be, she could reach up and close the windows. And now, of course, I raised the windows as high as I could because she couldn't reach them because I thought it was a stupid rule. But these are some of those rules that weak cultures have. Obviously, you don't need something like that in a strong culture. All right, so quickly in terms of the decisions, we talked about these four in chapter one. I'm not going to go into each one of these now about how they're affected by culture. The only one I really want to talk about is the leadership one, where the leadership style is appreciated in terms of it works, it fits into that specific culture. Now, we're going to talk about leadership styles later in the course, but take my word for it for right now that the transformational leadership style will be much, much more accepted than a transactional leadership style or a laissez-faire leadership style. I'm just going to leave it there for now, but trust me on that one. And when we get to later on in the course, we'll talk about that more. All right. So in regards to organizational culture, one of the few, one of more, yeah, I'm getting tongue tied here. One of the things I want to talk about more is, yeah, absolutely. It talks about productivity and it can increase productivity, increase engagement. Um, if you feel good about where you work and if you feel strongly about where you work, you're going to produce more. And a lot of us identify about where we work. And I'm like that as a teacher. I love being a teacher and I identify being that. But I've been in other organizations where I was ashamed to say where I worked, and I'm no longer like that. And so the reason that is part of the culture, and we're able to do our own things. We obviously we get learning objectives, but how we teach the class is up to us. And with that type of culture, with not the strict rules, I love doing what I'm doing, and I want to keep doing it as long as I can. So the second key word here is going to be productivity. Now, a customer responsive culture. We mentioned earlier about how um, we have customer focused, where the customers are put first, and we have the employees put first. With this, in terms of customer responsiveness, the personalities, they're going to be the face of the organization. I've worked in Panera, and I worked at the cash register taking orders, and I loved that job. And part of it is that I like being there, and it shows and how my personality comes out to welcome the people and tell them about the food we have. And imagine your experiences where you go to enter fast food place here, in a restaurant here, that you get a person that has no personality, they don't care, they just take your order and that's it. Well, we don't want that. You want that person that's more robust, who cares about the product, who cares about the customer. And I'm not going to read these others to you really quickly, but I do want to touch on one really quickly. I'm sorry. And that's empowerment. And that gives people the opportunity to make things right. For example, to make changes if needed. For example, again, at Panera, part of my job too was go on the floor and make sure that the floor was clean, talk to the customers, and if there was an issue with the food, if it was kind of bad, now we didn't have very often, we are pretty good. Um, I had the power to give them a cookie if they weren't too happy with the food, things to be going a little bit south. It's amazing what happens when you solve it with a sweet tooth. You just give them a cookie, they smile, they're happy, and they'll come back. And so these are some of the empowerment things. Instead of, hey, I got a customer, let me get the manager and see what happens there. Nah, just give them the cookie and move on. That's empowerment. And that's what you want to do for your employees too. All right. So innovative culture, again, the ideas of how we want to create our environment of work. Trust and openness, absolutely. That's where these people, that's where you don't have the strict rules. You trust your people. Um, the conflict resolution, talking. Debates are good. Conflict is good. If done right, conflict is good. We're gonna talk later more about that later in the class. But what I do want to say is, if you approach questions such as "what if" to play devil's advocate, it's not confrontational and that's accepted in a culture. Whereas you scream, rah, 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 that's going to be a little different. Um, in regards to innovation, the idea to think for yourself. Um, you know, you have a shot at creating a process that works better than what we're doing now, and you'll be surprised. Good management teams will be open to that. And we talked in chapter 1 about efficiency and effectiveness. If you can do something to increase both, they're going to listen to you. And the open, innovative cultures will let you have that. So the third key word is going to be innovation. Ethics. We're going to talk more about ethics in the class. But for just right now is knowing right from wrong and conducting business in a fashion where you're not ripping people off, in a fashion where you're not knowingly giving them an inferior product. All right. And so you have to be able to trust your employees. So going back to Panera, for example, we would never give them a sandwich, a salad, or soup that we feel that we knew was wrong or that we knew shortchanged them or that we knew just was inferior. We would never do that. And so that's the ethics of doing business the right way. And then the last thing I want to talk about in this chapter, because I'm getting 16 minutes and I'm taking more time your time than I want to. Creating a learning culture. You want this. You want to be able to learn from your mistakes, so that if you try something new and you made a mistake, okay, you learn something from it. Or you made a mistake, even though it's an old process, you made a mistake. What did you learn from it? And you learn more from your mistakes than you do your successes. And please promise me that you'll be that manager that will allow people to make mistakes and not feel like the world is coming to an end when a mistake happens. People know when they make mistakes, they feel bad about mistakes, support them. So that's my discussion about chapter 2. Hope you enjoyed the discussion. If you have any questions, please reach out to me and take care of yourselves. I'll see you in chapter 3.